Thank you. Gratitude certainly exudes on a night like this, and I wish I could name, as has been named, so many people who have made this very, very special. I will, however, call to mind, as Pat did earlier, the great ancestors, our elders, the First Nations, who inhabited this part of Kentucky, but inhabited all across this land. So let's bring their presence in with us in a new way, in a good heart way, along with all the ancestors who are still living and thriving, the birds, the insects, the fish, the waters, the air, the clouds, that are with us in so many special ways. I feel their presence. I hope you do too. So tonight we have a wonderful task of bringing forward what you've been working on for 24 years, and that is this sensibility of the local and the global that is so present here, and I hope it will just burst forth across our country, because you set such an amazing example. So the sense of place and planet, Journey is an invitation in a very special way to say we're not just from Louisville, from Kentucky, Lexington. We're not just from the Midwest. We're not just Americans. We're not just North Americans. We are part of an Earth community. We are planetary beings, Earth citizens. This is what we are inhabiting as never before in human history. And not only that, we are cosmic beings. So from our local place all the way to the cosmos. And this is a thrilling sensibility that we're learning. What does that mean? How can we imbibe, drink, feel, experience our cosmic earth and human sensibilities? And that is exactly what Chinese thought has done for 5,000 years almost. It's an invitation for all of us to become truly awakened, you might say. So it's a spiritual journey, an invitation to a deepening of what is our full identity. The stars are our ancestors, as we might say, from the carbon atoms that come out of supernovas. And you will have a chance to see Journey tomorrow where we say exactly that. The stars are our ancestors. We have this sense then of enhancing our identity, broadening our sense of where we belong. We could put this just in 4 words, maybe, this invitation. It's orienting ourselves to the cosmos. Who doesn't love to look at the stars at night? You know, what a thrill that is. But we're also grounding ourselves in the earth and the processes, this extraordinary spring moment. I really rejoice when the birds come back and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is not true, right? So the flowers, this incredible moment of rebirth that we've just celebrated with Passover and Easter and so on. So what does these sensibilities of orienting and grounding, but we're also nurturing. And we started tonight with this lovely reception. All religious traditions have the sense of nurturing ourselves. Without, as you are exemplifying, the clean air, the water, the grounds, the soil, all of this is part of the nurturing for healthy people, healthy planet. Well-being of people and planet is what we're really aiming at this point in history. And probably, I think we all know, it's one of the most critical moments in human history. I'm going to say something about that in a moment. How do we bring this in? How do we have a sense that we can have an impact? Well, first, I would say what I've just been saying from local to global is a change of consciousness, which many of you are working on in a variety of ways of meditation, of spiritual paths and so on, of science and religion. But this change of consciousness also means change of conscience, a conscience. And the beautiful sense that your city has done thousands of acts of compassion. So from consciousness to conscience, to the actual acts of compassion. What an extraordinary transformation, you see, you are already modeling. And that's what our young people want to see. I can tell you at Yale, at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where I teach, we're a 100-year-old school. Many of our great environmentalists have graduated from there. These students are so eager to move into their phase, you see, their sense of how they can contribute to a flourishing Earth community. So what we're going to see tonight is a clip from this Journey of the Universe project. So there's the film, which you'll see offered several times during this wonderful festival. And tomorrow, John and I will be here to discuss it. So it's a film. It was on PBS and so on. But it's also a little book. And then it's this series of conversations where we're trying to engage scientists and environmentalists and historians and economists and energy folks saying, okay, great story, great work. You see, what's to be done in these transformations? So I interview these folks. I certainly learned a great deal. But tonight we're going to watch Cynthia Brown, who was a historian, which we call it Big History. How many of you have heard of Big History? Okay, so let me say why we might have a cause for optimism, as Owsley and others have said. Because if we think about this, in one lifetime, which would be my parents' generation, some of your parents' generation, okay, let me illustrate it by my family, because you are people who really understand family and what it means. My grandfather taught at Columbia, Carleton Hayes, and what he tried to do was bring into that department European history, okay? Because he said, First World War, what happened? Second World War. We've got to understand Europe, not just American history, okay? His student, Ted DeBerry, went to the Second World War and came back as a student of Japan, actually, and began at Columbia one of the most amazing programs in Asian religions, history, culture. I was a student of Ted DeBerry's. So my grandfather, Ted, and myself, and I did Asian studies, especially China and Japan, Korea. Now, when I graduated from Columbia with my PhD, I began to teach world history. Now, world history is in many high schools, right? Okay, so world history was saying we've got to bring together this larger Earth community, okay? And it was people teaching Asia, Africa, Latin America. But there was still one more step, and that was, you can say, big history and Journey of the Universe, which means we can't only tell human history, we have to tell universe history, Earth history, and human history. So what Cynthia Brown is going to be doing here in this discussion is showing us the thresholds of change in that big history, okay? And I really want to tell you, students get this like this, and it gives them a sense of belonging and therefore possibility of entering in to the great transformation of our moment. So thank you, and we'll go. Cynthia, welcome to the program. One of the questions I'd love to ask you is how you and other historians have begun to periodize this immense sweep of time. You and David Christian, I think, really are the leaders of this field now in big history. And you're calling it something like thresholds, right?
Yes, that is the word we're using in the new textbook that we're writing. One of the real pioneers in figuring out the periodization is Fred Speer, who teaches big history in Amsterdam. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Structure of Big History that pretty much the rest of us are using in the way he laid it out there. So we've decided to use thresholds as the word for the turning points in big history. When you tell the whole story, it's just helpful to have chapters. So looking at the whole story, of course, the first one is the Big Bang. The next one is the formation of stars and galaxies. The next one is the death of stars, the explosions that created all the elements.
The supernovas.
The supernovas, exactly. So that's 3. And then the 4th is the formation of our star and our solar system and our planet. And then the emergence of life we call the 5th threshold.
The first living cell in life.
That's right, the first living cell. Now, we could have another threshold at the emergence of multicellular organisms, but we don't. We wait until the emergence of Homo sapiens to mark the next big threshold. And then once we get to Homo sapiens, then, of course, the rest of history goes pretty fast. The next threshold is the emergence of agriculture, which very quickly develops into civilization in its technical sense of cities and big states. And then the last one is the burning of fossil fuel with the onset of the Industrial Revolution.
So all of that happens very quickly in relation to this big, big history.
Exactly. So the pace is accelerating very fast. And now everybody seems clear that we feel we're at another turning point, that the way we're living now is not sustainable, so it's not going to last much longer.
So is this one of the reasons why you're keen to tell the story, and when people see these large thresholds and so on, and see our present moment, there's a kind of a wake-up call?
Exactly. It seems clear that there's just no way we can solve our present crisis without understanding where we've come from and how evolution works.
So there's a real sense for you that telling the story has a sense of giving us a sense of our possible future, perhaps, or how we may create a future in alignment with this large, large story.
Exactly. And I'm glad you used the word alignment. For me, the story makes me feel aligned with reality. The story helps me understand how everything came to be the way it is, who I am, where I came from, how I got here, where we are in the story now, and what the possibilities are for the future. So in that sense, it seems to me like a creation story for our time. That's a phrase that I've used, and David Christian he calls it the scientific creation story. It answers the same questions that creation stories always answer for their cultures.
Exactly as you say, where we've come from, why we're here in a way, or that's the big question, and how we might navigate into the future.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Yeah. And maybe give us just a sense of certain parts of the human story.
95% of human history was hunting and gathering, at least, probably 99%. And that's something we've left out of our textbooks for so long. I guess we're not going to do it anymore. But that's the first place that we have to remember, that almost all of our history, how we're biologically evolved, and what we're made to do is hunt and gather. So the rest of human history is a very, very short piece of it. And the big turning point, of course, is agriculture, when we domesticate ourselves and settle down in one place.
And when do you date that approximately?
About 10,000 BP. This is the easiest way to round it off.
Before the present.
Before the present. And the present is defined as 1950, I guess, just so the date won't keep moving. But so that's more like about 8,000 BCE. And that coincided with a warming climate, which certainly was part of the necessary conditions for it. But then, all the fascinating question is, why would people settle down and start farming? And we've always described it in terms of progress. Well, of course, anybody would farm once they had the idea. But now historians are beginning to see that life was much easier under hunting and gathering for most people, and that farming involves a lot more work that people wouldn't really necessarily choose unless they had to. So now we're beginning to analyze the reasons why they had to do that.
A stable food supply.
rising population, so there are not as many places to move to, a declining wild animal population, and a warming climate that made it possible.
And they came to these river valleys, right, for these early civilizations as they emerged.
Right, although the first agriculture apparently was practiced in higher, cooler altitudes. But then as the climate dried and heated up and dried, people were driven into the river valleys.
So we've got Mesopotamia and the Nile, and the Indus Valley, the Chinese Yellow River.
And then later, of course, in the Americas that are not river valleys, in the Central America and in the Andes.
So these are the rise of these major civilizations. And again, you date them from when?
About 3,500 BCE. And of course, the really fascinating thing is that they arose independently, as far as we can tell, in at least 5 or 6 areas around the world, more or less simultaneously, although the Americans were a little later.
And they required sophistication of organization and so on.
Exactly. Well, then you get into what really defines a civilization. And they're much denser populations. They're specialized occupations. They're much more complex organizations. They have tribute that's collected by force if necessary. That's one of their chief features. And they have much more energy flowing through the system than earlier.
Material energy and trade and...
Right, but not only material energy, actual natural, energy, which includes foodstuffs and trade and all these. So that many of the big historians are seeing the defining pattern to big history as increasing complexity. And then complexity they're defining as the amount of energy that flows through mass or matter, and plus the number of combinations there are. So they're actually trying to measure this increasing complexity.
Which is true for the whole universe system.
Exactly.
And you're saying we're seeing it especially as civilization emerges too.
So it's part of a bigger pattern. And then civilization, of course, produced these large city-states that just kept getting larger and larger as they fought for resources. And so we call them empires, and there's this whole era of agrarian empires that are battling for resources and increasing their trade and their complexity.
Including the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire that was in contact across the Silk Road, right?
Exactly. So the Eurasian zone got the most complex because they had the most interaction and all this flow of ideas and trade that was still separate from the American zone.
Right.
And then, of course, there was the Pacific zone, too. So that there were even hunting and gathering people, of course, still living their traditional lives while this complex kind of civilization increased and increased until the two worlds finally came together.
With the Columbian explorations, as they call it.
Exactly. The Columbian exchange, I guess is what we call it now. Columbus landed over here and set off this whole exchange of foodstuffs, tomatoes, corn, potatoes, mustn't forget potatoes, tobacco. And this foodstuffs not only went to Europe, but went to China, so that they supported increases in populations in both places. There was a big exchange of people, of course, not all of them voluntary. There was, of course, the slave trade from Africa.
And the influence for native peoples of this exchange.
Okay, and the other exchange was of diseases. And this, of course, is a big point, that the people in the Americas didn't have domesticated animals. There just weren't the big animals on this continent that were domesticatable. So they weren't immune to the diseases that Afro-Eurasians had built up by their contact with animals. So when the Eurasians came with animals, the diseases wiped out a lot of the population in the Americas. And that was a very unfortunate result of the exchange. But this exchange greatly increased the wealth of Europe. They were situated on the Atlantic, and they were able to make use of the new land to grow crops. They used the slaves, of course, to produce wealth. And they used this wealth to invest in technological innovations, like the steam engine, which set off the Industrial Revolution and set off the burning of coal as energy, because England had burned up all its trees. They were just running out of trees, which is why they had to resort to coal. But this pushed us over a new threshold because it added so much new energy to the story. All this stored solar energy we're burning that was stored 300,000 years ago, we are burning to create the civilization that we have today.
So stored energy is now exploded into the atmosphere, the air, the seas, and transforming our climate, our ecosystems radically.
Exactly, and that's our new understanding that really has only come in the last 10 or 15 years, although scientists were beginning to see it already at least by 1970, but it's taken this long for the rest of us to assimilate this into our thinking and realize that we're just very rapidly changing our whole ecosystem.
So we're at this very critical threshold, aren't we?
It looks like we are at another threshold.
And can you tell us, will this story help us get across the threshold?
Well, who knows? We don't know. I mean, that's part of the excitement of being at this threshold. We're in a time of very rapid change. The climate, the planet is always changing. We kind of forget that because unless we know the big story, then we know that this is the case. But this is a period of very rapid change, and we don't know how we'll get through it. But looking at the story, we can say that humans have experienced these thresholds before and figured out ways to come through. And the ways that we've figured out seem to be our collective learning, our ability to think symbolically and communicate and invent new technologies and pass them on to our children. So it's hopeful that we will be able to do that again this time.
And that we might be able to think for, as they say, future generations, for our children. So thinking into the future is what distinguishes us. So there's this possibility
So we better do it this time, way into the future.
Indeed. So I think some of this is hopeful, but also challenging, and we're going to invite our speakers to come up and discuss this. They've seen the film, I think, most of them, and we're also going to open it up eventually for questions. So I think you have their bios, but I'm just going to read the first sentence of them to introduce them. Please. Yeah, thank you. So to my left, Woman Stands Shining is a Dene mother and grandmother, activist, artist, writer, ceremonial leader, and international speaker. And we've heard her earlier this evening. We have Marium, Husain, also to my left.
No, that's not it.
Sorry. No, it doesn't matter. Sorry. I was jumping. Okay, we'll go back to Elizabeth. Sorry. Elizabeth has studied and practiced the Buddha Dharma for 30 years. Her teacher she met in Nepal, and she is a master in Colorado of a center at the moment. Marium Husain is an oncologist at the hospital of the Ohio State University, and she does work in palliative care and a whole range of things for healing and food insecurity as well. And finally, Rabbi Nadia, who we heard from earlier, who serves as the Vice President for Mission for Kentucky One Health, a Jewish hospital, at the Fraser Rehab and at Our Lady of Peace as well. So please join me in welcoming these panelists. So why don't we begin with Woman Stands Shining? And I just want to say this is a larger project. So I wanted to explain that the Journey of the Universe film, my co-writer and the narrator of the film, Brian Swim, himself is Salish, from the Salish peoples of British Columbia, and he's also a scientist. My husband, who helped make the film too, specializes in native traditions and so on. So we are trying to build in what's often called traditional environmental knowledge and so on with scientific knowledge. But this is a great, and two of the other interviews are with Danae from the Four Corners area, actually, to respect and talk about how these are cooperative ways of knowing in the best senses of the word. But first, let's go back over to Women Stand Shining.
Just for general.
Yes, for some of your reaction, you had a chance to see the film and so on, and then this particular little clip. But what was your impression in seeing the larger film, and how it can possibly, how stories in general can bring us into a sense of our larger purpose?
Right. I think that's what struck me the most, is how we make meaning from what we're calling big history now. And I want to say that, indigenous cultures, I would say worldwide, that I've encountered. I live in Taos, New Mexico, but I travel extensively, and I spend a great deal of time in indigenous peoples' gatherings. And so right now, there is a lot of referring to our understanding of big history. And so it was an interesting journey to go through, like, the scientific creation story. And I agree with it's Catherine?
Cynthia.
Excuse me.
Cynthia Brown.
Cynthia.
Mm-hmm.
Cynthia, that it's an orienting thing to have that long view. And so I think while on the one hand I feel like the science is it's so dang literal. It's so dang literal for me in terms of a creation story, right? And by that, I guess what I mean is it's so grounded in intellect and rationale, what data we can put together, and then I find it takes like these fantastic leaps that make me go, see how it is? See, when you're trying to put together that big history, that eventually you end up in the storytelling place. Right? Like, you just can't stick with the data the whole way. And I feel like there was something very powerful about that for me, because there's a much longer story about this, but I can't go into it here. But I feel like indigenous understanding of cosmology and how this whole place works has been disregarded for its storytelling parts, right? And so this is actually, to me, a very hopeful place of a meeting ground, of being able to enter into story together. So now, as the world's leading scientists are telling this story, and people can kind of make that leap with them because they're like, well, their science was sound here or there, or they have the credentials or whatever that might be. Now we can begin to discuss what our stories say. And so that was something that struck me right away. But I guess what I will say about this little clip that we just saw, I find it really interesting, the demarcations. I guess she was referring to them as thresholds, huh? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, and I would be curious if other panelists had this phenomenon happen, but I was thinking, like, what else might I call a threshold that wasn't really named there? And for me, this is, I have to, it's a little embarrassing, but it's the first time I've ever realized that when they talk about the Columbian Exchange, that they were talking about Columbus. I thought it was about, I don't know what I thought it was about, but I didn't know that was like the moment. I was like, what? The Columbian Exchange? But for me, that would be a pretty big demarcation on the planet. And I'll just say one small thing further, and I'll release this mic here. But and that is because, as I have been saying, if sustainability is the highest and most sought after technology on the planet, who should we be talking to? We should be talking to those peoples who've lived in one place over an extended period of time, or who know a territory for 1,000 years, 5,000 years. And so that interruption of what is being referred to as sort of hunter-gatherer, which is a pretty nebulous area, really changed the face of the planet and our place on it,
Good.
in my view.
Okay, let's have some sort of short comments, and then we're going to have some more discussion, and maybe we'll go all the way over to Nadia. And what is your sense of story and how it gives meaning and purpose to humans in relation to what we've just seen?
Well, Judaism is very much a storytelling people. And as a rabbi, as a therapist, as a chaplain, I'm mindful of the ways in which the stories we tell have tremendous subjectivity. So I'm still stuck on the Columbian Exchange and some of the sort of very seemingly neutral words to describe horrific situations. And I haven't caught up to that. And that might be where the tension is between religion and science sometimes, because they're telling the same story but from such different places. As I was watching the movie or the video, I was really struck by the need, just listening to that version of the story, of our story, the need for reconciliation and reparation and healing, and how catastrophic that move towards energy has been for people and for our planet. Judaism, as I understand it, developed at a threshold, specifically the threshold from the agricultural to the city. Because the biblical religion from whence Judaism and Christianity emerge was one where we had our first offerings of vegetables and fruits and animals, and that was an agricultural kind of religion. And as people moved into cities, that was no longer possible. And so Judaism, like Christianity, both rebelled against that understanding because there was an attempt to try to maintain and preserve what existed previously into the next threshold, shall we call it. So people were buying animals to offer, right? And that was the money changers that Jesus was opposed to. And Judaism as well, the early rabbis sought to reinterpret the biblical religion through the lens of the Talmud, and to really look at a more spiritual and rendition of how to offer the offerings of our hearts instead of our first fruits. So as we stand on a new threshold now, I'm mindful that in the same way as, and I can only speak as a Jew and as a rabbi, that in the same way as Judaism had to reinvent or re-understand, retell the story of Revelation with a new lens, that of being in a city, and that was more focused on equity and justice. We now are at a new threshold, and so what Judaism will become, what all of us will become, is really dependent on that same level of willingness to reinterpret and to move beyond the literal to something more, hopefully hopeful.
Thank you, Nadia. We're going to actually jump over to Buddhism, I think, just to mix it up a little bit. Elizabeth, how would you like to enter this discussion?
Oh, boy. So we're talking about big history. Or I can just tell you what my hit was from this whole thing.
Yeah, because you saw the film too, right?
Well, unfortunately, I just saw this part.
Okay.
So I'm apologize for that. I didn't realize that I was watching the wrong thing. But anyways, I'm getting a sense of what this is. you know, in the beginning when you did your introduction, you talked about identity. Mm-hmm. To me, that's what hit me the strongest, like who are we in relation to the world around us? And I felt, as Pat did, that a little bit limited by the story, I think, in a certain way. It felt very linear to me. And it felt, of course, I love history and I love it as a story, but I know everybody is having a completely unique experience because we live in the nature of infinite contingencies and we all experience things in a very different way. Now, this is a very Buddhist way of looking at things. And it reminded me of a conversation I remember that my husband, who's also my teacher, he's Tibetan, my teacher, had with my late grandfather. And we were removing a bug from the wall rather than squishing it because we try not to kill beings. And my grandfather kind of got insulted. He was a very gritty, practical man, and he said sarcastically something like, "Oh yeah, it's just God's chosen creature." Like we just had this belief in creation that he couldn't relate to. And my husband said to him, "Actually, Grandpa, we don't believe in a singular cause or a singular God. We believe in seed and fruit," meaning that we have an understanding of that things are interdependently arising. In Buddhism, there's no singular creation. There's no singular creator at all. That things are moving and dynamic and everything is mutually causing everything else, to use the words of Joanna Macy, mutual causation. And so this takes it a little bit out of the linear realm. I love stories. I love history. I actually listen to, books on tape and historical accounts all the time. But for some reason, I can't think of them as truths, It's interesting. I'm just I feel like I might be a little bit of the odd man out here, maybe in a certain way, but this is just what came up for me when I was listening to her. So.
Yeah, and I think, well, to see the film is different.
Yeah,
Seeing,
okay. I apologize for that.
No, it's totally fine. So, we're kind of jumping in medias res, and this is fine. This is life. This is where we are. And so thank you, all of you. And we're now coming to you, Marium, about Islam, the Quran. What might have hit you here, or I don't want to put you on the spot either, but the film is the context, so I hope that you'll have a chance to see that at another point. But
sure,
yeah,
absolutely. So I think it's a good mix between what Rabbi Nadia was saying too about storytelling, because Arabs, I'm not Arab specifically, but the Quran being in Arabic, that Arabs were storytellers too, and then I think exactly what you said too about identity. So. To try to keep it as succinct as possible. So exactly like what Thomas Berry was talking about too with the news story. So what is our story? Why are we here, right? Exactly like you were saying too. What is our identity? What is the purpose of life? And just disclaimer, I don't know. But at least from what I take from the Quranic tradition is that to gain what the Arabic word taqwa, which essentially means it means fear, but not fear of an angry God, but fear of a knowing that we can never know a powerful God who is in control of everything. And that fear is actually more humility versus being scared. And that actually gaining something called God consciousness, which is what Thomas Berry was talking in the movie was talking about as well too, that we have been in this very egocentric, linear, right, history of since agriculture, right, that this happened and this happened and this happened. But we have 14 billion years worth of a history as well, where God was involved, where there was nature was involved, and we don't really know our place because we don't really think about things outside of ourselves. And it becomes very ego-driven that way. And so for a Muslim, I guess, like from my perspective as well too, that if you can gain that God consciousness, you're almost going above this physical realm, and then you enter metaphysics, you enter quantum physics, you enter this whole idea that time is not linear, but the past is or the present is past and the future is now, and you can actually see have an idea of maybe an inkling of what God could be and of what He is. And for me, I think it says, isn't that the point? Is the point to have accolades and have all this material wealth on the planet when we're destroying it? Let's just call a spade, that when we're destroying it, or is it something where you have this intellectual wealth, and where God is not just this one's God, my God, your God, but He is something that none of us can ever fathom, but He has given us something so beautiful, like science, like laws of natural laws, to even have a glimpse of what He is and what the greater context or greater story it actually is. And we're just being short-sighted and can't get ourselves over ourselves to figure it out.
Thank you. So, again, just to provide a little more context, I'm a historian of religions, and so is my husband. And so we did build into this film a sense of stewardship from Judaism and Christianity, of trusteeship from Islam, of this beautiful word. We are trustees for the earth and its future. And certainly Buddhism, tradition I love and teach, of interdependence, or interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh might say. And very much so, what Pat has spoken about, kinship with all of life. So our notion over 10 years, you see, was to bring these magnificent traditions into dialogue with science. So it wouldn't be just linear or rational and so on. So we had scientists over the summer working on this, et cetera. So it's an offering. It's one telling. There'll be many, many more. But let's just say we know we have this tension between science and religion, and yet we need to find ways to overcome it. I see it at my school. It's a science-based school. So maybe we can just jump into that space of science and religion and so on. And I don't know who'd like to pick that up. I don't have to. Okay, please, Pat.
So one thing I was thinking about in the longer film is it talks about. It was really fascinating. There was this big noting of the externalization of consciousness as being a very big turning point in human history, and so I really had to think about that. Meaning, it went from there directly into our being able to use symbols to express our consciousness, meaning writing, for one thing, and how at that point we were able to sort of begin to collect knowledge from different places, and to be able to have that collective or shared knowledge places, and from there things really shifted. And similarly, one of the thresholds was when we shifted to agriculture, or the agrarian periods, and in both those instances, it's talking about how this big turn came toward what we often refer to as civilizations. My daughter has a long spiel about what she thinks about that, about whether that really is civilization. But I was thinking about that, and in both of those instances, for me, what I notice is that we say that, and I especially heard it, and so I was appreciating her take on it, Cynthia's take on it, about agriculture, that when we hit agriculture, that we automatically had to go into hoarding, into these big political structures, and I thought it was interesting she brought up the tribute, sometimes by force if necessary. Yeah. And so those places, to me, what I would say is I have it's never sat well with me, because I'm going to say that we have evidence of cultures who exist today who have been in agrarian practice for quite a long time, and it hasn't led to those places. And the same, I would also say, is true of, this expression of our consciousness externally. So maybe these things weren't done in alphabet, but they were done in other ways, right? And so there are humans all over the planet who have engaged in these activities who to this day are not feeling led to go down some of the paths that modern world has chosen to take. And so to me, that's an evidence, if we're going to look for evidence, that it's not those activities inherently that lead us to where we are at this moment. There's another ingredient that we're missing. And one of those, and I might say that my elders would talk about, where's your original instructions? Right? Where are your original instructions that help guide whatever the activity is? And I don't know how many people here know Orland Bishop's work, amazing being, an avatar for our time. But he said something that reminded me of this. He said, we were talking actually about philanthropy and economy, and he was saying, it's not that we need to do things, we're not trying to do this correctly. We're trying to do this sacredly. And if we do it sacredly, whatever needs to be corrected will be corrected. And so I think that this is where the faith part or the spiritual or cultures that contain some kind of guides or even laws for how things are to be done is part of that missing ingredient. And so I know, like for us, for instance, we might say, I don't have the right to get in between what the Mother Earth wants to give to any one of her children. I have no place being in the middle of that. I have no place in there saying, if you want water, you're going to have to come through me. If you want food, you're going to have to come through me. Or we can extend that in a lot of different ways. But also, even in the Ten Commandments, I was just hearing this recently. This is sort of more the spirit in which I feel like my elders talk about these laws. It says, thou shalt not steal. And it was proposed, it's not so much that you can't steal. Obviously, people do steal. I mean, so there's this moralistic view of it. But what was being proposed is that there are laws of this construct where if you steal, eventually it ends up being taken from you. And it's not a conscious thing. It's not anybody doing it to you. It's not any law enforcement. It's the nature of this place. And so that's what I feel like we're missing a little bit of in some of this conversation that I think would be good is to maybe look at what do we know about the nature of this place and the laws that uphold it and the laws that uphold life.
Thank you. So what I'm going to propose is maybe, one more round from the others, and then we'll open it up for some conversation. So Nadia, would you like to say maybe something's on your mind, or the science and religion space?
Sure. So the medieval Rabbi Saadia Gaon, said that while God gave us the Torah, God gave revelation, we could have come up with all of those truths on our own through science and through our mind and through discernment. It would have just taken us a much longer period of time. And so the Jewish understanding of science and religion is that they're just different ways of speaking the same truth. So back to my colleague's idea, or what she was trying to share, we have this understanding that God is unknowable and is beyond human language, and there are just a lot of different attempts, but they're all human and fallible to try to speak truth. And so given that, and given that Judaism thinks of creation as this progressive incarnation of God's Spirit into the world, and the very first part of that, before there was even God creating the world, the first step was God withdrawing of God's self to make space for the world. So in Judaism, right, in the beginning there was God, and then God wanted to create the world. So God needed to make space for the world. So the very first act of creation was what we called Tzimtzum. It was like this vacuum to make space for matter. And then God infused God's self progressively into that space that was filled with matter, and eventually matter, which is finite, couldn't contain God, which was infinite, and there was this massive explosion. So, I mean, in a sense, Big Bang was described by the rabbis hundreds and hundreds of years before scientists did. And the idea around that, which certainly supports Sadia Gaon's idea that there are varying versions of truth that exist, but eventually we need to find the ways in which we connect. The very first act of creation from a Jewish mystical perspective was the withdrawal of self. And so when I think of the sort of slow progression of history, it was very much this progressive conquest of self over Earth. And what it seems to me that our next step could or should be is really that creative step of withdrawal of self, so that we can enter into a place of humility. The reading of Albert Einstein and the delusion of self, and how what we need to do is we need to go beyond by withdrawing of our egos and withdrawing of ourself. That seems to me where we need to be, and perhaps science can help us.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to go to you. Because there was a sense of no self just mentioned, I thought we should bring in Buddhism.
Actually, I'll just start from there then. So in Buddhism, you often hear this term no self, but it doesn't really mean a lack of true identity. And I was thinking about, how to explain this. This is not always that easy to explain in this kind of context. I was thinking, why am I having trouble fitting into this conversation? And I realized, because although we have stories in Buddhism, inspiring stories that inspire us to practice, I don't think that Buddhism is so much about storytelling as it is about really looking deeply at the nature of one's mind and experience. And so I was trying to figure out, because I love history and I love stories and I think they're very important, but in certain ways Buddhism is about getting beyond your stories.
Zen koans, though, are also stories.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, they're different. But
this is just how I'm experiencing this right now.
Yeah.
But the thing that really is interesting to me about this conversation, you talked about citizenship too. I find that fascinating, because when we're looking at the nature of, say, reality, or looking at things realistically, I prefer to say it like that because it's much more practical. We're looking at the nature of interdependence. And the nature of interdependence means that what we perceive as our outer world and our inner world are arising interdependently. The world is moving and dynamic, and everything is influencing and interrupting everything else, and our mind is moving right along with it. It's when we reify things that we actually kind of get behind the game. We get lost, and we are unable to relate to the world in a very healthy way, I think. So I often think, who am I in the nature of contingent relationships? Like, I don't know what my purpose is, as if it's some kind of prescribed purpose. But when I look at the world around me, I ask, well, what kind of agency do I have in this system? I don't live in a vacuum. I'm part of the great nature of infinite contingencies. Like Owsley was also quoting Einstein, this idea of a singular, permanent, independent notion of self is an optical delusion of the mind. So, I often think, well, who am I? In a way, I'm a citizen of a family. I identify with my family. That's my identity, or my spiritual community, or, my citizenship as an American. Or, I also am a citizen of this incredible planet. But actually, the most accurate way to understand who I am in terms of how I understand it, is I'm a citizen of the great nature of infinite contingencies. Like, that's bigger than anything, you know? And what does that mean in terms of agency and understanding myself and my responsibility as well? Recently, I got one of those really nerdy T-shirts that has a galaxy on it, and then has a pin and says, "You are here," like very small. So in a way, we're kind of a speck in the universe. And on another hand, we're master of our universe. It's like everything we do matters because we're part of the great nature of infinite contingencies. So everything we do has reverberating effects. So we're both a speck in the universe, and we're a master of our universe, and that means that we can't really feel diminished, but we also can't get bloated about our achievements. So where does that lead us? But we can't find a self that's singular, independent, or permanent, and yet we have this incredible agency and efficacy in this system. And that, if I were to say, who am I would say that's who I am. And it's not a singular thing. Yeah. It's not one or not two. I'm not the same or separate. There's another status that I have as a human being or a being in this incredible system.
Yeah. Beautiful. And what was striking me, Elizabeth, as you were speaking, and Nadia as well, because all these traditions do have their mystical parts, and First Nations people know this very well. But all of these traditions are actually trying to get us to experience our microcosm in relation to the macrocosm. You see, that's what Elizabeth just said so beautifully. And many of these creation stories as well. But certainly the mystics in Judaism and the Sufis and so on are trying to get us to experience something much larger than a static self. Along those lines, would you like to jump in again? Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess, with science and religion, you guys remember those necklaces, those friendship necklaces that were kind of like your friend had the one and you had the other one and the whole would become, I guess the girls might remember that more, but I feel that way about science and religion, right? Is that they're part of the same thing. And kind of, we were talking about identity, right? And so for me, it was always, okay, growing up as a Muslim, you're a person of faith. But then you go into science and then you become, all very hardcore science, medical school stuff. And it's one of those things where it's like, do those two connect? Like, I just don't know. And then thankfully I was able to connect with this gentleman, Nick De Palma, with Space Time Labs. If no one's ever heard of them, please check them out. He and I have spoken a lot, and we actually came up with this blog post about interviewing current Muslim scientists and then relating them to the days of old, the golden age of Islam, as it were. And then through that process, you realize when you actually look at history, and you actually look at the religion and what the text actually says, the very first thing that was sent to, a revelation that was sent to the Prophet Muhammad was read. Very clearly, just read, recite, to read, not even recite, but to read. And he was illiterate. And so this concept of, read in the name of your Lord, and talking about how man came from this clot-like substance, which now, in embryology, we relate to the semen, and then relating things back to the egg, that there was this, from the very beginning, this concept of learning and knowledge, and that again, finding that consciousness with God and getting yourself aligned with God was through this pursuit of figuring out God. And the fact, relating to the microcosm, macrocosm, all this stuff about the universe, it's a lot. It's a lot to understand. We still don't understand it. So God, I feel like God is very kind in that sense, that he's made this world where we can understand things in a very human way that is then over our brains, right? And then in that pursuit that it's okay that there's natural laws, because they don't conflict with God, because he is the creator, Lord of all the worlds is what the Quran says all the time. All the worlds, this microcosm, the soil, the greater universe. And so it's just one of those things. I don't think it's disparate at all, that by using science, by using humility, you can actually figure out more about your religion and what worlds. What are there other, is there a multiverse? Is there, different worlds? Is there, Neil deGrasse Tyson will talk about how we might even be living in different dimensions right now. And one last thing is that my new favorite astrophysicist is this Marcelo Geyser guy. He's a Brazilian, and he talks about the island of knowledge. And it's absolutely beautiful because right now, if you kind of think about it, before we really had this, that one threshold of consciousness, right? Externalization of our consciousness. We really were just in this little island of what we thought the world was, what the universe was. We're at the center of it. But the interesting thing about what he says is that as that island grows, as our knowledge grows, the border between what we don't know and what we know gets bigger too. And so the pursuit is, I think we were talking about that earlier in the day, that it's okay that science, that life is constantly changing or evolving because as our knowledge grows, there's so much more in that ocean that we still need to find out. And I think, those two parts of that necklace that it's not one or the other, it's a synergy of the two that will get us there.
Beautiful.
God willing.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you. So, and it's of course true, as I think you all know, that the early scientists in the 17th century, including Newton and others, were thinking that they were explaining the laws of the divine and so on. So this is how, in part, science arose. Okay, so it's now time for a few questions from the floor? No.
Yeah, we're at an hour, so let's take one, and then sadly I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
The conversation will continue through the festival.
And we thank these wonderful panelists for their great comments. Thank you.